My name is Emily, and my life was ordinary until the day everything turned upside down. I had always thought my marriage to Chris was stable, even though we had our ups and downs like any couple. We lived in a small but cozy house that we had purchased 3 years after our wedding. It was supposed to be our haven, a place where we could grow as a family. However, soon after we moved in, a surprise I never saw coming knocked on our door, literally. One sunny morning, Chris's parents arrived unannounced, towing behind them a moving truck filled with furniture and suitcases. I was standing at the kitchen counter making coffee when I heard the knock. Chris's casual tone still echoes in my mind as he called out, "Mom, Dad, you're finally here." I blinked, thinking this was some kind of joke. Why would his parents be here with so much luggage? Was this just a visit? I stepped outside to see Chris hugging them warmly, and that's when his mother turned to me with a big smile, saying, "Emily, we can't thank you enough for buying this house for all of us." Her words froze me in place. "For all of us," I repeated in my head. The idea of his parents living with us had never been mentioned, let alone discussed. In fact, when we bought the house, I imagined it would be just Chris and me, enjoying our new chapter together. Chris had always assured me that our life would be ours alone, with no external pressures. But here they were, with no prior warning, unloading their entire lives into what I thought was our sanctuary. The reality of the situation hit me hard as I watched them dragging suitcases inside. My heart pounded as I quickly pulled Chris aside and whispered, "What's going on? Why didn't you tell me your parents were moving in?" His response was so nonchalant it almost made me question my sanity. "What's so strange?" he asked. "We bought this house so we could live with them. Isn't that what you wanted?" My jaw dropped. This was definitely not what I wanted. I had talked about maybe, someday, living with my parents if they needed help in their old age, but never his, and certainly not now. Confusion swirled inside me as I tried to grasp how this decision had been made without my consent. I stood there, trying to catch my breath as Chris continued to talk, but his words blurred together. It was clear that he didn't see the problem. How could he make such a huge decision without consulting me? I felt betrayed, and my mind raced back to the conversations we'd had about our future. The plan was simple. We would build a life together, just the two of us. We had never agreed to living with anyone else. I couldn't stop the anger from bubbling up. "You didn't even discuss this with me," I snapped, my voice shaking. Chris shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable, but not enough to show regret. "Well, you brought up living with your parents once, so I figured we'd just do it with mine," he replied. The casualness of his tone made my blood boil. Was this how little my opinion mattered? His parents were already settling in, unpacking their things as though they owned the place, and I hadn't even had the chance to weigh in. I wanted to scream, to shake Chris and make him realize how much this hurt me, but instead, I stood there in shock, unsure of what to do next. Over the next few days, the house that I thought was ours turned into something unrecognizable. Chris's parents started rearranging the furniture without asking, moving things around as though they had lived here for years. I tried to talk to Chris about how I felt, but each time I brought it up, he brushed it off. He acted like it was no big deal, like this was just a normal adjustment. I began to realize that Chris wasn't going to take my side on this. In fact, it seemed like he had been planning this all along. The more I thought about it, the more I felt trapped in a situation I hadn't agreed to. His mother, Anne, would casually drop comments about how the house feels more like home now that we're all together. I smiled politely, but inside I was boiling with frustration. How had my life turned into this? Why was I the only one who seemed to care about what I wanted? I had tried to communicate my feelings, but Chris always found a way to dismiss them, saying, "It's just temporary," or, "They won't be in the way." But they were in the way, and it felt like they had taken over everything. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. Chris's younger sister, Kate, showed up for dinner. Kate and I had never been close. She was 5 years younger than me, with a life that always seemed to be full of drama. 3 marriages, none of which lasted, and now she was back, pregnant, with another man. I barely had time to say hello before she started in on me. I heard you've been making things difficult for Mom and Dad, she said with a smug look, her hand resting on her belly. Why are you trying to kick them out? I was stunned. Kick them out? I had never even suggested such a thing. Kate was clearly twisting the story to make me look like the villain, and Chris, sitting next to me, said nothing. He just stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact. I felt a wave of rage wash over me. Why wasn't he defending me? Why was I suddenly the bad guy for not wanting to live in a house I had no control over? I took a deep breath and calmly replied, I'm not kicking anyone out. I just wasn't informed they were moving in. It's my house too, you know. But Kate wasn't listening. She rolled her eyes and said, Well, maybe if you were nicer, Chris wouldn't have to choose between his wife and his family. Kate's words hit me like a punch in the gut. Choose between his wife and his family? Was that what this was coming down to? I couldn't believe it. All I had wanted was a life with Chris, a life where we could build our future together. But now it seemed like his family was more important to him than I was. Kate kept talking, throwing jabs at me, accusing me of being selfish, while Chris just sat there silently. I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed my chair back and stood up, glaring at Chris. Do you have anything to say? I asked, my voice trembling with anger. Chris looked up at me, finally meeting my eyes, but he didn't say anything. That was the moment I realized something fundamental had shifted between us. He wasn't on my side. He never had been. All this time, I had been fighting to keep our marriage intact, but he had already chosen his family. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to cry in front of them. Fine, I said, my voice cold. If that's how you feel, then I'll make it easy for you. The next day, I went to see a lawyer. I had thought about leaving before, but I never had the courage to go through with it. But now, with everything that had happened, I knew I had to protect myself. This wasn't the life I had signed up for. The lawyer was kind and understanding, listening carefully as I explained the situation. You don't have to stay in a situation that makes you unhappy, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. If you want to file for divorce, we can begin the process right away. Divorce. The word felt heavy, like a boulder in my chest. I had never imagined my marriage would end this way, but at this point, I didn't see any other option. Chris had made his choice, and it wasn't me. That evening, when I returned home, I felt strangely calm. I had a plan now, a way out. I walked into the living room where Chris and his parents were watching TV. Without saying a word, I placed the divorce papers on the coffee table. What's this? Chris asked, picking them up. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. You've made it clear where your loyalties lie. I'm done fighting for something that doesn't exist anymore. Chris stared at the papers in shock, as though he couldn't believe what was happening. His mother looked from me to Chris, her face pale. Emily, you don't mean this, she said softly, but I could see the panic in her eyes. I nodded, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. I do mean it, I replied. I can't live like this anymore. I can't live in a house where I'm treated like an outsider, where my opinions don't matter. Chris finally spoke, his voice cracking. Wait, can we talk about this? I didn't think it would come to this. I shook my head. We should have talked about it before your parents moved in, Chris. You didn't give me a choice then, and now I'm making my own choice. There was a long, painful silence. Chris looked down at the divorce papers in his hands, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Chris tried to reach out to me, asking if we could work things out, but I stood firm in my decision. I had spent too long putting his needs and his family's needs before my own. It was time to think about what I wanted. I moved out of the house and into a small apartment across town, away from the chaos. It wasn't easy at first. I missed the life I thought I would have, the future I had imagined with Chris. But as time passed, I began to realize that I had made the right choice. I had been suffocating in that marriage, slowly losing myself as I tried to fit into a role that wasn't mine. My new apartment was small, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I started focusing on my own life again, reconnecting with old friends and taking up hobbies I had neglected. I was rediscovering who I was outside of being Chris's wife, and it felt good. One evening, about a month after I'd moved out, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised when I opened it to find Kate standing there. She looked different, more tired than I remembered. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped aside and let her in. We sat down at the kitchen table, and for a while, neither of us said anything. Finally, Kate spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes downcast. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I thought I was helping Chris, but I see now that I just made things worse." Her apology caught me off guard. I had always seen Kate as a troublemaker, someone who thrived on drama. But now, sitting across from me, she seemed vulnerable, almost lost. "I know I wasn't fair to you," she continued, "and I'm sorry for that. I just wanted to protect my family, but I didn't realize how much I was hurting you in the process." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the resentment I had been carrying for so long. But another part of me knew that holding on to that anger would only hurt me more. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Kate," I said slowly. "But what's done is done. I've moved on, and I think it's time for all of us to move on." Kate nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just hope we can start over. Maybe not as friends, but at least not as enemies." I wasn't sure if I was ready to forgive Kate completely, but I could see that she was genuinely remorseful. "Maybe," I said, leaving the door open just a crack. Kate left shortly after that, and as I closed the door behind her, I felt a strange sense of closure. The chapter of my life that involved Chris and his family was finally coming to an end, and I was ready to turn the page. I had spent so much time caught up in their drama that I had forgotten what it felt like to live for myself. But now, standing in my own space, I realized that I had the power to shape my own future. As the months went by, I continued to rebuild my life. I started a new job, one that I was passionate about, and I began to travel, exploring places I had always dreamed of visiting. I was no longer tied down by the weight of my past, and it felt liberating. Every day I grew stronger, more confident in who I was and what I wanted. I no longer defined myself by my relationship with Chris, or by the expectations of his family. I was my own person, and that was enough. Looking back on everything, I realized that leaving was the best decision I had ever made. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I had found my way back to myself, and for that, I was grateful. My story wasn't about the end of a marriage. It was about the beginning of a new life. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it head on, with strength, courage, and a new